before I continue, let's start recording, otherwise some people will get pissed. Okay, we're recording. Primarily this should be the entire week basically should be come from a point of understanding, and then you are going to build up to a nice illustration at the end of the week where you can use all of the knowledge that you've gained in order to make those pretty illustrations. But those illustrations should come from a place of understanding and not primarily first start with pretty lines and then try to figure out what's underneath, because that will just make messy drawings. Okay. So let's start first with the Loomis head explanation. Now, before I do that, maybe we can start by, for anyone that's not familiar with the proportions of the human head. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a profile first. And the way that Loomis explains the profile of a head is that he basically starts with a sphere, and then he cuts that sphere in half. All right. Can you guys see that? What I'm drawing? Yeah, okay, cool. So he cuts that sphere in half, and what he does is he indicates where he cut the sphere in half as the height of the eyebrows. Now keep in mind, it's the height of the eyebrows and not the height of the eyes. He keeps the eyes a little bit underneath, but we'll look at that in the 3/4 view. So once he indicated the half of the sphere, he will indicate the top of the hairline, which will be just underneath the top of the circle, which is the cranium in this case. And because you have these two widths now, you can multiply them 3 times down. So this from this to this, which will give you the base of the nose, and then 1 down, which will give you the base of the chin, right? And then he connects the chin with the other half of that sphere, right? And essentially creates the head. Oh, and just as a small disclaimer, I do have some glitching going on OBS with this camera. I'm not sure why, but it just happens occasionally. So if we look at it from the front, what he does is, again, we go with that sphere, but as I'll indicate now in the profile, is that here he will chop off a side of that sphere, which we can indicate in this case like this. So instead of having a full round sphere, we kind of have this squished sphere on the sides, which better represents the cranium. Again, we can cut that sphere in half, get the height of the eyebrows, indicate the top of the hairline, multiply this down 3 times, and get our proportions of the head. Okay, so basically that's how Loomis kind of indicates those proportions. Now to kind of transfer this into the Loomis head, when we look at it in 3/4, we do the same thing. We start with a sphere, and then we use another sphere to illustrate the chopped off side of that cranium. And the sphere, or the ellipse that you'll use in order to chop off those sides, will depend on the perspective of your head. And I think that's one of the best indicators to actually start with drawing heads in proportion or in perspective, is that the side plane of your cranium will indicate kind of the tilt and perspective of your head. So if I just do this, for instance, we'll be looking at it just a bit straight on actually. But if I draw a sphere and then I indicate my plane here, then I'm pretty sure I will be looking up at this head, because my side plane has tilted all the way up there. Okay, so that's something that you can use to kind of understand the spatial awareness of your portrait. Okay, so again, then we chop that sphere in half, effectively creating the height of the eyebrows. We indicate the top of the hairline, go 3 down, which is 1, 2, 3. Connect the dots, and then because we have this half of the sphere, we kind of create that Loomis head. Now what Loomis also does is that he makes a rhythm line going from the side of that, chopped off half, and then he creates a rhythm to the front of the chin. And he does that because what he illustrates is that this area is what he calls the flattened area. So as you can see, it already indicates kind of a more planar view of the face. Okay. And then if we attach the neck, we effectively get like a head indication. Okay, and so this is what Loomis does for every head construction almost. Now, the hard thing for a lot of beginners is that it looks very logical in this way, or a straight on way, but it gets very difficult once you get extreme tilts or just rotations of the head. And what you could do is the same as, again, what we did do with the fish, is that we can break it down into simple shapes. Hang out in just a sec. I'm just going to change my speakers. Okay. So instead of doing it rhythmically, what we can do is think about, because we divided this face into multiple sections, what Loomis also does, by the way, is that he creates a shape. He creates 3 shapes. So what he does is he creates a half sphere for where the eyebrows cut that sphere in half. So basically creating half a cylinder. I'm going to use another color to illustrate this. And then he cuts off this part as the jaw, as another shape. And then we have the back of the cranium as that 3rd shape. So if we redraw that, is that we have half a sphere, like this. And then from the eyebrow down to the jaw is kind of a tapered box, like this. And then that other small piece of the cranium, like this. Now this might be easier or harder for you to figure out in the beginning, but the cool thing about this, if we just chop off that half, the cool thing about this is that it will make it easier for you to understand how you manipulate those simple shapes in order to get character and personality into your designs. So instead of always doing those perfect proportions, what you're actually doing when you're drawing or when you want to infuse personality into your characters is that you create imperfections. That's where characters are made. That's why, humans look the way they do. That's why we can differentiate each other. Otherwise, we would all have perfect faces, and that would just be freaky, right? But before thinking about the shape manipulation, what's good about this is that you can practice this to draw in perspective, right? So if you have some issues with drawing the head in perspective, this is a really good way for you to try and understand how that face or whatever looks in perspective. Now, there's another way that you can look at this, and that's also something that Loomis illustrates, is that you first create a sphere, and then you kind of create a mask for that sphere. So the mask will be halfway down of the sphere, like this. Right? Essentially creating the same thing. Now, if we want to see the back of that face, we could do the same thing. We create a sphere. You can start by creating the side plane first. We determine the half of that sphere and then create a mask for that sphere. Right. And just adding those two simple together, they will already read as a face. And then it just becomes a matter of adding a neck and a nose and some eyes, and you have a face. Right? So let me do that just a bit bigger. So there we have a sphere. We indicate the side of that sphere, which is our cranium. And then we determine the half of that sphere, which will be around here. And so we know that our mask will have to look something like this. And this is a great way to practice your perspective, especially with faces and facial structures in perspective, because this is easier to understand. And as a designer, a concept artist, illustrator, whatever, you're always trying to minimize the amount of problems that you're trying to solve. So in the beginning, if you struggle with this, you first begin with these two simple basic shapes, and then you add simple basic facial structure features on top of that. So instead of drawing a nose, we simplify the nose into a tapered box and add that box onto that simple face. Right? Then it becomes easier for you to understand everything in perspective before adding complex anatomical structures to that simple geometry. Okay? Does that make sense? The hairline part, is it always at the end of the top part of the side circle? Well, that kind of depends, Manos. In order to get your proportions correctly in the beginning, you could maybe indicate it, yeah, at the top of the side circle, which will help you with the tree down proportions, because everything goes into thirds from the top of the hairline to the eyebrows to the nose to the bottom of the chin. These should be 1, 2, 3 equal parts that give you like the perfect proportions. So yeah, you can definitely do that if you want to. If you're a bit off, that really doesn't matter. What I just want you guys to realize is that there's a lot of ways to interpret that Loomis head, and I just want you to really understand its construction and not just copy how Loomis is drawing it. So more of coming from a place of understanding, as I said in the beginning. So I think these two ways of doing it, like adding a sphere with like a mask, like a sphere wearing a mask, or these 3 parts, which is, half a cylinder, like this, and then a box, and then another small quarter cylinder, right? And if you practice these shapes in perspective, you will get so much better with your head construction overall. Then it just becomes a matter of understanding a bit of the structure underneath, like the muscles and the skull anatomy, to get a more believable indication into your designs. Now, if we want to create, characters or personalities, it becomes a simple um, exercise of manipulating the simple shapes that we just established. So, for instance, if we have the normal Loomis head with the side plane, top of the hairline, cutting in half like this. Right? We can just start to manipulate those shapes to create completely different looking characters, right? And that's essentially what Loomis is saying in that book. We're manipulating the basic shapes in order to get character features. Right? And most of us, that's what I use a lot. Most people actually don't have that strong of a jawline, right? We're not Hollywood stars. So what usually happens is that we have top of the brow like this, and then we'll have the basic shape running through like this, but then the other one doesn't connect like this one does, right? Essentially creating that perfect chin line. It will go and meet it at the bottom and then connect on the other side, giving us that weaker kind of chin look, which again most of us get with old age, or just people that are a little more fat. If you go really fat, you can do this, have the chin. You can still have the same proportions, like 1, 2, 3. Have the chin here, but then exaggerate where that boxy shape is coming from. All right. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm treating those simple shapes as if they were very pliable, like gelatinous or something, and then you can have fun with those shapes. You can inflate them, you can squish them, you can elongate them. So for now, I've only been drawing like perfect circles, but you can use that circle and just squish it like this, right? Then the same will happen for the side plane that you're chopping off, and you can create like a really long face, right? But within that long face, for instance, with like if we draw an orc or the proportions of an orc, we can draw that really long jawline, for instance, but we can keep the proportions. We can manipulate the proportions. So instead of having 3 perfectly divided feature proportions, we can use a very short nose, but then the lips will be here, right? And the bottom of the chin is here. That's essentially what an orc looks like, right? So all these simple shapes are just being manipulated. And I think that's one of the key features to understanding the Loomis head. Right? Any questions about that? About the Loomis head overall? Feel free to use your mic. I mean, all right. So that made sense for everyone. That's good. If you have any questions about it later, feel free to ask. All right, moving on to the facial features. So we'll start with the eyes, which is usually a big problem for people. And again, this comes directly from the Loomis book as well, where you can study it. But I think a lot of people struggle with indicating the structure of the eye and getting a bit too caught up in the anatomy of the eye. Where I think you should just be focusing on what simple shapes the eye is constructed of. And if we again start with a sphere for the eyeball, and we can cut that sphere in half if we want to, but we don't need to. So the eyeball, the iris, will sit somewhere over here, right? And then we basically have a lid covering the top and the bottom of that eyeball. So what we're actually just creating is a shelf that covers the top and the bottom. And this actually, if we look at it from a mechanical standpoint, it hinges and it can, you know, open and close. Well, usually it's predominantly the top lid that closes, right? And if you like, it's very beneficial for you to start with simple shapes like this, because again, if you want to draw something correctly in perspective or make it look believable, using these simple shapes, it becomes a lot easier to understand that. So without thinking about anything else, where the anatomy goes or anything, just starting with this will help you move forward a lot quicker. So if we want to look at an eye from the, like, if we're looking up at it, for instance, we can draw our eyeball again, and then maybe draw the iris here, and then do the same thing, right? So the lid, and then instead of opening it like this, which would be unnatural, we kind of need to follow the contours of our shape. To make it look more understandable in 3D. And you can do the same looking down at the eyeball. Now we'll see a lot of that bottom plane. And this is where that hinge joint would be. Okay. So if you practice that, you will get a better understanding of the eye structure in general, just by doing simple things like this. Now, of course, the eye isn't a hinge joint, or it's not mechanical, and it's not super protruding like this. It's usually covered by the lid fold. It has a scientific name as well, but it's basically the muscle that's surrounding the eye, which is called the orbiculi oculi or something, orbiculus oculi. So it's surrounding the eye, which is basically where your eye socket of your skull is. And this muscle is creating a fold that is surrounding your eye. And so it's part of that fold that we see in our skin. So if we have an eyebrow, and we have our eye first, then we have the tear duct connected to it, we have the bottom lid, right? And then we have the upper lid as well. Now, we're not connecting these because usually what happens is that there's a little bit of an overlap created by that fold. So if we follow the contours of this eye, it will be a bit of a bulging, in most cases, a bit of a bulging eye fold, or lid fold, sorry. Then we have the upper eyelid, and then we're actually going down, which is the thickness of that eyelid, the roundness of the eye, and then the upper plane of that bottom lid, and then we go down in the eye. Right? And this is basically the structure of the eye. Okay. There's a difference in some structures between ethnicities. The most visible between different ethnicities is Asian eyes, and the main thing with Asian eyes is that the lid fold actually goes all the way down, covering the upper lid. So you won't see almost anything of the upper lid. It will just be the complete lid fold, and then we'll go into the eye. So same thing, if we draw the eyebrow, then we have the eye like this. The tear duct will kind of be hit underneath that lid fold. We will still see a very visible lower lid, right? But this will just be the fold completely covering that upper lid, right? That's mainly the difference between the two ethnicities. Now, there's many differences between many different cultures, but these are the two most visible, especially when it comes to drawing. Okay, so another issue that I often see when people are drawing eyes is that they're drawing them on the same plane when you need to draw two of them. So everyone seems to understand that we have curvature in our head when it comes to drawing the head, but then when people start drawing the eyes, they kind of draw them on the same straight plane, and that just doesn't create that believability that you want into your character designs. Now, in order to train that, again, we're going to minimize the amount of problems that we're trying to solve. So instead of drawing a head construction, breaking your head over that, try to design eye sockets or eyes onto a curved plane. So for instance, if we draw a curved plane like this, we're going to try and draw our eye sockets onto that curved plane. Right, same thing. This is kind of a straightforward one, but you can do the same with like a really curved plane. And then things get a little more tricky. And that's why you want to really practice this, because essentially what we're doing is we're going to take this eyeball, because we're tilting up, and we're going to project it onto this plane. So we know that we're going to see a lot of the lower side of that upper lip. I'm going to exaggerate that for a second. And then instead of opening up downward, we need to follow the curvature of the plane to kind of make sense that we're looking at an up-tilted head. And then we're going to see even less of the other side, because mainly our nose is going to obstruct the other eye. But that's kind of what we want to keep in mind. When drawing these eyes, right? So thinking about the simple structure first will help you with the overall believability when drawing these features. Let's see if I had anything else to say about the eye. Oh yeah, in terms of stylization. So there's a crucial reason why we want to understand the structure and not per se all the fancy anatomy and terminology, is because the structure is actually what you're applying and what you are manipulating. So if we understand this structure, we can start manipulating it, and more importantly, stylizing and minimizing it. So that's what you see a lot of artists do, is they will, let's first start by drawing a well-structured eye again. So we have the thickness of the lid, we have the tear duct, we have the top plane of the lower lid, we have the entire lower lid, we have the upper lid connected to the fold, and then we have our eyebrow. And we're looking suspiciously backwards, right? Okay, so the more structure you put into your drawings overall, the more believable they'll become. Now, sometimes we want to suspense that believability, and we want to create a bit more of a stylized nature, or just very cartoony, right? And usually that happens, I say usually, when we start to minimize the amount of information that we're sharing. So instead of going from very well structured, we can go to a little less structured by, for instance, drawing an eye that looks like this, right? And then we can go even less structured and just draw this. And then what you see Kim Young-ji doing a lot is that he'll just draw the top lid and fill in the eye, right? But you need to understand why he's doing that. So it's not that he just learned to do this. No, he understands this and he can minimize it to this degree, right? Does that make sense? All right. Cool. So yeah, on the topic of Kim Young-ji, while we're there anyway, and we're doing eyes. So what I said in the beginning of this video is that we want to come from a place of understanding and not a place of drawing pretty pictures, right? Because many beginners, even many of you, try to make a pretty picture each time you're doing the assignments. Basically, that's not the idea. What you want, especially for day 1 and day 2, is create the understanding of the subject that you're studying and then applying that into day 3 with more aesthetically pleasing designs, right? And the reason you do this is that, like, for instance, what I've been telling you about the eye for now is this is basically what Kim Young-ji or any other professional artist is doing when they're drawing a feature like that. So I'm using the brush pen now because that's kind of the staple tool of Kim Young-ji. And if I just look at one of his drawings, and I'm going to just extrude the eye from it. So what he does is that, for instance, when he draws a female eye, is that he'll do this, make it thicker here, thin here, like this, and then a very subtle line like this, right? Now this will, in the overall structure of the face, this will read as an eye perfectly, even with thickness, and it will have a lot of believability. Now, the reason that is that because I've been explaining this to you guys, you will probably understand it better, is that all he's thinking about is that he knows that the eyebrow and the eyelashes will create a dark line, and he's indicating that thickness that we have from the lid, right? And he's indicating that with a thicker stroke, and then he's using a very thin stroke to indicate where the eye meets the upper lid, but he's not drawing the upper lid, right? So he just indicates where the eye will meet that upper lid, which is this line, very subtly, and he will also create a subtle line for that fold, right? And then if he wanted to shade it a little more, he'll probably he'll leave a gap here because he wants to show that light is hitting that upper lip. So what he does is this, and then he just smudges it. This is printing paper, so it doesn't smudge that well. He'll just smudge it to create the effect of that shadow hitting that lower lid, right? Same happens when artists like Karl Kapinski, for instance, what he'll do often is he will create only the shadow parts that are created by an eye. Now, this is a bit of an advanced concept, but I just want to show you guys why they're coming from a place of understanding and not just only doing aesthetically pleasing stuff. Or they're doing aesthetically pleasing stuff because they have that understanding. So when in most lighting scenarios, when we have an eye socket, and let me just use the same color. So when we have an eye again, the lid, the folds, tear duct, upper lid, lower lid. So when light is hitting here, the darkest part will usually be here on the lower lid, and usually casted by the eyelid itself. And then we'll fade out probably like this. So, but the darkest area will definitely be here in that eye socket. And so what artists will do when they're drawing a face is we'll draw a nose. They'll just draw the shadow parts of what they know is created by usual generic lighting scenarios, right? And this instantly creates that effect of an eye being there. And then you can pretty it up with nice line strokes and nice line drawings. But that's essentially because they're coming from a place of understanding. Does that make sense? All right, cool. So moving on to the nose is basically the nose is kind of an exception because there's not a lot of difference between the structure of the nose and the anatomy of the nose. When we have the nose coming from the skull, it's that we have the nasal bone, which will be here, and then we have the eye sockets of the skull. On top of that nasal bone, we'll attach the upper alar cartilage, which is divided in two, but like this, and then it fans out like that. Right. So if you look at that in a front view, it essentially looks like this diamond shape cut in half. Right. And then below that, just indicate that with brown, is the lower alar cartilage, which is also divided in two, and it connects like this, and then goes down to the bottom of the nose, and then we have another one on the other side. And then what makes up our nose is the fatty parts connecting to that alar cartilage, which creates that quintessential look of the nostril, right? Because we have the alar cartilage coming in here, and we have the fatty parts of the nose. All right, so this is something that you just need to study. It's pretty straightforward. It's just the nasal bone and the cartilages, and then the fatty part. You can do this in a front view, you can do the side view, just to get an understanding, and then you can start doing it in 3/4 views. Now, the same thing here applies where artists will use a place of understanding in order to manipulate the facial features. Again, what I'm doing, for instance, when I draw a nose, is that I'll draw this part of the nasal bone like this, and then I'll exaggerate, for instance, that upper alar cartilage, and then I can manipulate those shapes in order to create the sense of a nose, right? If you look at some of the let's see, like popular dwarf noses, for instance, from guys like Paul Bonner or Evan Amundsen, guys like that, they do the exact same thing. It just comes from a place of understanding, is where they'll have like the bridge of the nose, and then they'll highly exaggerate that upper alar cartilage, then the lower alar cartilage goes down, and then they'll exaggerate the nostril, Again, still understanding where it inserts and then creating that fatty part and then adding, you know, dwarf features. Right. And again, we want to come from a place of understanding first. We can always pretty things up later. Right? So, but in essence, it's always everything comes from a place of understanding. And if you want to create believability, like Paul Bonner does or Karl Krapinski does, you kind of accentuate the structure. If you want to suspense the believability, or you want to leave it out, make it more stylized, make it more cartoony, you kind of ignore some of that structure. For instance, you can also draw a nose like, maybe we draw an eye, simple as this, and then we draw a nose like this. We're indicating some of the features, but definitely not all of them. And it would start looking really weird if we add a lot of structure to one feature, but not add it to another. Right? So it's always a balance of keeping the stylization consistent in all of your features and your proportions. Okay, now lastly, the lips. Let's see if I have another color. So for the lips, same thing. We'll start by drawing them in a front view. First we have the philtrum. Which is the place between the bottom of your nose and the top of your lip. And like the curve. Let me just first draw the lips. Bit thicker lips, but that's okay. Hope you can see that. Right, so the curve here, that bow, is called Cupid's bow, I think. And that will usually follow the shape of your philtrum. So if your philtrum is really sharp, your Cupid's bow will be really sharp as well. If it's kind of soft in its curve, then your lips will be soft as well. Right. That's just a consistency feature that we see with a lot of people. You can definitely make exceptions in that, but that's just what tends to happen. So if I redraw the front of the lips, philtrum. What Loomis explains in his books is that the lips consists of five parts, or you can separate the upper lip and the lower lip. And so the upper lip has 1, 2, 3 parts, and the lower lip has 1 and 2 parts. And then again, like with the eye structure, you should start applying that lip structure onto curved planes, because again, when we draw the face the Loomis way, and we have the simple shape of the nose. Right. Our lips do not exist on this flat plane. Our lips are actually on top of our tooth cylinder. So in the skull, if I quickly draw the profile of the skull, we have the nasal bone like this, and then we have the tooth cylinder kind of sticking out. Right, and then we have jawline and the other tooth cylinder. So usually what artists tend to do is accentuate that tooth cylinder. So if we draw the Loomis head again, we will have the nose, and then we will have a tooth cylinder that represents that our teeth protruding forward in the skull. Right? Again, this comes from a place of understanding. So you want to practice drawing lips onto a curved plane because that's what tends to happen. So we can draw that curved plane. And then project those lips on top of it. Now, before doing that, one of the main shapes that you should remember from the lips is actually where the lower lip meets the upper lip. And I will accentuate this in blue. This shape is one of the best shapes to remember, because that essentially gives us a very realistic representation of lips. So if I project this shape, this line, which is the middle of our mouth, onto that plane, I can follow the curvature of that cylinder and create lips, right? Now, again, this comes with practice, but that's something that you should try to understand, is that this shape between the lips is a very good one to indicate how lips can look. And then I don't know if anyone of you seen this, but Karl Kopinski explained that how he draws lips, and essentially what he does is what I'm doing here, is that he creates this shape, he repeats that shape, and then he does this, which is actually that bow and that straight line, that Cupid's bow, and then he connects them. Right, like that. This is a bit exaggerated. But now the reason why I'm not drawing the lips like this, which would make more sense for you guys, right? To follow that curved plane, which is basically projecting this shape. The reason I'm not doing that is because we have to keep overlap in mind, because our lips have thickness, right? So this lip goes like this and then like this. So when we turn those lips in space, we can see shape number 2 in space, you know, like this. This is shape number 2 in space. But then that curvature is something that we will pick up on slightly, but then we will pick up the contour of our lip, because our lip has thickness. So we cannot follow the entire curvature and then follow this line right here. So we're picking up the contour of that upper lip, and then for the shape coming towards us, this one, we can then again follow that curvature of our shape. I know that's probably a bit hard to understand, but I hope it kind of made sense. That that's what makes effective drawings, right? Where you can understand where we are seeing just ridges or shapes, and where we are seeing overlap, or where the contour lines are actually beginning to show instead of the primary shape. Um, so that's something that you should try to keep in mind when drawing anything, basically. And then the simplification of the lips is basically where we leave out the realistic shape, which is this one, right? And where we just replace it for, and I'm just going to draw this in perspective, for something like this, and then just indicating, lips like that. But again, that all comes down to taste. All right. I think that's it for me on the facial features. Did any of you have any questions surrounding those features? How would it be from a profile view? Well, basically the same thing, Manos, is that we just project this onto profile, and again we are considering the thickness. But usually when we have the bottom of the nose, which is our alar cartilage, right, coming into the skin, we have the lip protruding out because we have that tooth cylinder underneath, right? So we have the lip like this, and then it kind of becomes a flavor thing. We can give it an underbite, which means that the lower lip would be going further out than the upper lip, but usually people tend to have lower lips that are a bit shorter than the upper lip, right? Like this, and we would go into the chin. And then because we're in complete profile, we're not gonna see that Cupid's bow because we're completely in profile. So it's gonna be very subtle, and then we're gonna pick up to the corners of the mouth and connect like this. Always place the bottom lip too far forwards. Well, it kind of depends, TW, because I tend to do that as well. When I'm drawing a character, for instance, what I might do is do something like this. And then indicate that contour line of my tooth cylinder, protrude the lip like this, right? So you can definitely add a lot of character with protruding that upper lip. It just lower lip, sorry. It just kind of depends on what kind of character you want to illustrate. With lips, I mostly have trouble drawing men's lips without them looking well like women. Aha. Yeah, that seems to be a constant issue, and I think the other way around where happens a lot as well, Jasmine. And so what usually tends to happen, and yeah, let's cover this for a second before we close off, is the main difference between men and women is the softness of their features. Okay, so it's much easier for me to draw men because I can just keep all those hard features in mind. So let's just start with like a very visible nose bridge, right? And then the alar cartilage like this, strong jaw, and then a very visible tooth cylinder, and then the chin like this. Right, so men tend to have a very visible tooth cylinder at the edges of their face, a stronger chin, right, and a stronger jawline as well. Now, what men don't usually have is a very big upper lip, and I think that's usually where you maybe go wrong, is that if you just leave out the upper lip, or not indicate it that hard, or make it very thin, it will already look a lot more masculine than if you were to give it a very big upper lip. Because if I gave this guy a very big upper lip, suddenly he just looks weird, right? So it's all in that, in the size of the upper lip. When we look at women, for instance, women have a lot more soft features, but they have very pronounced lips. And that's not true for all women, okay? This is just because as artists, we usually try to emphasize the stereotype. Okay, when you're illustrating female hands, you'll make them softer and more pointy than when you're drawing male hands. You do the same for the features of the face, right? So if I have a woman's face, everything will be softer. So I'm not even indicating that upper alar cartilage of the nose. I'm just leaving it blank, just only showing the lower cartilage, just like a small portion of it, then protruding the jawbone, but then coming in pretty quickly, and then having that softer chin. And then we can really emphasize those lips and exaggerate the eyes. To give it more of that, female appeal. All right. Any other questions or things you might want to know? How do you draw anime noses? Whew. Let's have a look at an anime nose first, right? Okay, so anime noses actually aren't. They're like the super simplification of a head. Right? I think the success in anime is that, and maybe let's try this with the brush pen, is that there's a huge amount of stylization in all features and an exaggeration in the proportions. So, for instance, with the eyes, is that they'll really exaggerate the features. And again, small, it all comes down to line weight, right? And then for the nose, they actually just only show the bottom of the alar cartilage and then just the nostril, just like a small portion, like that. You know, so anime faces are really all about the super simplification of things. So it can be very daunting, but that just comes down to understanding the perspective of your face, the face that you're drawing, and then just knowing where to exactly place those lines, because it all comes down to the simplification of the underlying structure. Like with the anime phase that I'm seeing here, for instance, is that we have the face, we have a cheekbone like this, highly exaggerated. And so the nose will just be this simple line and this small nostril indication. And then they have a huge exaggeration of the upper lid. A huge exaggeration of the lower lid. And an exaggeration of the pupil or iris. And then just cute nose, bottom lip, call it done. Oh, you tricked me. Okay. I see. All right. Any other questions before we wrap this up? All right, guys. So I hope this was informative. I'll be sure to. Well, I am recording this, so I'll upload this to the website for you to review, and be sure to apply some of the things that I mentioned here. Yeah, the tooth cylinder, just like one last time on the tooth cylinder, there are a lot of artists that will even exaggerate that tooth cylinder. When you look at for instance, someone from the back. So if we look at the Loomis head from the back, it looks sort of like this, right? Boom. But what artists tend to do is do something like this, just to emphasize that tooth cylinder. Right? Not even indicating lips or anything here, just indicating that tooth cylinder is enough for you to get the impression that we are looking at a human face. All right, now I'm done. I'm gonna go eat because my wife called me. No, I'm pretty sure that's on the recording. Eating time, you lazy bastard. Stop playing with your friends. All right, it's been awesome, guys. I'll see you in the next one.